Hello everyone and welcome back to Biology with Mrs. Evans. In the last video we looked at photosynthesis, the process of converting light energy into chemical energy. In this video we are going to look at cellular respiration, the process that basically breaks down our food in order to make ATP, and we're going to look at the details into how that works. Remember from the photosynthesis video that photosynthesis is the process, again, that is going to make food. And remember, the reactants are 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water. In the presence of sunlight is going to yield glucose, remember, which is C6H12O6 plus 6 O2. If you noticed from the picture on here on the slide, cellular respiration is basically the opposite of that. So it's taking glucose, which is C6H12O6, plus 6 molecules of oxygen, and it's going to break that down to form 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 H2O plus ATP. So again, cellular respiration is the process that breaks down glucose in the presence of oxygen to make ATP. And we refer to this basically as a cyclical pathway because the products of one are the reactants of the other. For example, if you look at photosynthesis, the reactants are carbon dioxide and oxygen, and you'll notice that they are the products of cellular respiration. So cellular respiration, again, is the process that breaks down the food that we eat. And if you take a mirror and you put it to your mouth and you exhale, you will notice that the mirror starts to fog up and eventually you'll see a collection of water drops. So those are basically the products of our cells breaking down the food that we eat in order to produce energy. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct, and we're also releasing water, which you can collect on the mirror to help you remember basically the products of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration can go one of two ways. It always starts with the first step, which is glycolysis. Glycolysis, if you do a literal translation, means the splitting of sugar molecules. So glycolysis, remember from our notes in class, is the process that breaks down glucose, and that takes place in the cytoplasm. All cells, regardless of whether they are a prokaryote or a eukaryote, are going to be able to do glycolysis and therefore cellular respiration. So if you see a question on a test or on the SOL that asks you which organisms can do cellular respiration, the answer should be all organisms, because glycolysis is the first step. And then if it is a prokaryote, glycolysis will then go into basically the electron transport chain, and that happens over basically the cell membrane in a prokaryote. But for a eukaryote, glycolysis will go into the mitochondria. And remember, prokaryotes lack that, so that's why the cell membrane is going to play a role in production of ATP for prokaryotes. So basically it is there are two pathways, and it all has to do with whether or not oxygen is present. So if oxygen is present, it will follow the pathway of glycolysis, followed by the Krebs cycle, followed by the electron transport chain. However, if oxygen is not present, then glycolysis will be followed by fermentation, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So there are two pathways, and it all depends on whether or not oxygen is present. So, again, because oxygen is required for cellular respiration to take place, at least in the later stages, it is referred to as aerobic respiration. And aerobic basically means oxygen is present. Just like if you do aerobic exercises, then you are basically taking in lots and lots of oxygen. So again, the process for cellular respiration, the three main stages are glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And again, glycolysis is simply breaking down a glucose molecule to form what we call 2-pyruvate. And those products are then going to enter into the Krebs cycle. The products of the Krebs cycle will then enter into the electron transport chain, and we're going to look at that here in a second. So again, the first step, which we learned in Unit 4 is glycolysis, the first step in cellular respiration. So glycolysis is breaking down glucose to form 2-pyruvate, also referred to as pyruvic acid. There are other molecules that are being made in the process of making the pyruvic acid, such as NADH. And basically what is happening is hydrogen is being added, or electrons are being added to an NAD plus molecule. And then those NADHs are going to be used to make ATP in the electron transport chain. But for us, we're going to say that glycolysis is breaking down glucose to form 2 molecules of pyruvate, or pyruvic acid. It does not require oxygen, so this particular step is what we call anaerobic, because it doesn't require oxygen. And again, it takes place in the cytoplasm. And again, it is key to note that all organisms, regardless of whether they are plant, animal, prokaryote, or eukaryote, they're going to do this first step. So here is a picture representation. Basically, you see glucose C6H12O6. Notice that pyruvate is C3H4O3. So basically it took a 6-carbon chain sugar, which is glucose, and broke it down into 2 3-carbon sugars. And then the hydrogens that have been removed have been used to make NADH. And I really don't care that you know the NADH part, because that's getting into higher level biology when you take AP Bio. If you do that next year, or you take biology and chemistry, then you would need to know that. But for us, we just need to know glucose is broken down to form 2-pyruvate. And ATP is going to generate, or not ATP, sorry, glycolysis is going to generate 4 ATP. But it took 2 ATP in order to break the bonds that are found in glucose. So it had to spend some ATP in order to make some ATP. So 2 ATP were used to help break the bonds found in glucose, but it generated 4 ATP, so we say that glycolysis nets 2 ATP for the cell. This is a relatively fast process for the cell. The cell can produce thousands of ATP in just a few milliseconds, but it comes at a cost. So basically, when the cell runs out of oxygen, it then has to go into fermentation, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So glucose is broken down to create pyruvate. A byproduct at this point will be carbon dioxide. We're going to basically exhale it as we are doing cellular respiration. So then what happens is that the pyruvate that was generated in glycolysis is now going to enter the Krebs cycle if oxygen is present. If it's not, that pyruvate would then go into the fermentation cycle, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the Krebs cycle is named after the scientists basically that figured out what was going on, and it's also sometimes referred to as the citric acid cycle, and that is because basically the end result of the Krebs cycle is to create citric acid. So in the Krebs cycle, just know that pyruvate is going to be broken down into more carbon dioxide in a series of energy extraction reactions. And this step, again, as I mentioned earlier, is going to require oxygen. And again, this step is also going to take place in the mitochondria, and basically in the matrix, which remember is the inner portion of the mitochondria. So when glucose is broken down as much as we can get, we are going to breathe out the excess leftover carbon dioxide, because we can't do anything with it. So again, carbon dioxide is a byproduct of cellular respiration. So the Krebs cycle is going to generate 2 ATP for the cell. And then the products of the Krebs cycle will then enter into what we call the electron transport chain. I refer to that as the moneymaker, because there's lots of chemical reactions that take place to generate basically 32 ATP for the cell. The electron transport chain is a complicated process. Again, if you learn it If you take biology in college, you'll learn more about it. But for us, you just need to know basically that the electron transport chain takes place also in the mitochondria. It also requires oxygen, and it creates 32 ATP. So putting it all together, one molecule of glucose can yield the cell 36 ATP. All right, 2 netted in glycolysis, 2 ATP molecules in the Krebs cycle, and then 32 ATP produced in the electron transport chain. And again, this takes place in the mitochondria. So, if oxygen is not present after glycolysis, the cell will go into what we call fermentation. And fermentation is basically taking the pyruvate and creating either lactic acid or alcohol, ethyl alcohol, as a product. So because fermentation does not require oxygen, we refer to it again as anaerobic, just like glycolysis is a anaerobic respiration, because neither of them require oxygen in order to take place. So some organisms are going to do what we call alcoholic fermentation, and basically what that is it's taking the pyruvate that was generated from glycolysis, and it is going to break it down into ethanol. And this should be an arrow. So 2-pyruvate is going to be broken down into ethanol plus carbon dioxide. You will see carbon dioxide being given off. And we take advantage of this process in order to make alcoholic beverages, also to make any type of bakery item, so bread. That's what causes the bread to rise, is because of the fermentation process that's going on. Excuse me. Lactic acid fermentation is also a process that takes place by some organisms. As humans, we undergo lactic acid fermentation, and again, this is a process that's going to take the pyruvate, or the pyruvic acid, and it's going to break it down, and this should be an arrow because it's going to break it down to form lactic acid and carbon dioxide. So we also take advantage of this process in order to make things like cheese, yogurt, because the cells are going to be creating lactic acid. And again, we do this when we run out of oxygen. So if you've ever ran a race or done any type of exercise and you start to feel that burning sensation in your cells, it's because now your body has switched from doing aerobic respiration to doing anaerobic respiration, and lactic acid is starting to basically build up in your muscles, and you feel that burning sensation. So chemical pathways, you need to know basically there are 2 ways that the cells are going to create energy from the food that we eat. One is where glycolysis is followed by the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. Those are dependent upon whether or not oxygen is present. If oxygen is not present at the end of glycolysis, then the cell will go into fermentation. This is something that you are going to be able to see in a lab that we're going to do process-wise. So again, what you need to know is that cellular respiration is a process that is carried out by all organisms, regardless of whether or not they are prokaryotes or eukaryotes. It starts in the cytoplasm with glycolysis, and then if it is a prokaryote, it would move to the cell membrane to carry out basically the Krebs cycle, not the Krebs cycle, but the electron transport chain. And then if it is a eukaryote, it will be followed by the Krebs cycle in the mitochondria, followed by the electron transport chain, also in the mitochondria, if oxygen is present. If not, then it would continue to take place basically in the cytoplasm, and it will go into fermentation. The other key that you have to remember is that photosynthesis and cellular respiration are what we refer to as cyclical processes, because again, the products of one are the reactants of the other. So we breathe out carbon dioxide and water, and plants are going to take in carbon dioxide and water in order to make glucose. And we are going to take in oxygen in order to be able to do cellular respiration, and our cells are going to break down the glucose that was created by plants. So this is a brief overview of how cellular respiration works. Again, you will go into more details in the ins and outs of cellular respiration when you take biology in college or if you take AP Bio, but these are the basics that you need to know for me and for the SOL. So again, remember, photosynthesis is a anabolic process because it's a building up process. It's building glucose, and then cellular respiration is a catabolic process that's going to break down that glucose into ATP, and then carbon dioxide and water are basically byproducts of that process. That's the basics. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in class. Bye.